A teacher is fired for intervening in a bullying situation involving a student from a humble background. So he decides to. James Cooper walked through the school corridors with the same ease as someone who has been doing it for years, but his eyes were always attentive to every student. For him, teaching went beyond books and exams. His true mission was to create a space where young people could feel safe. His history classes were not a mere repetition of dates and events, but rather a window into understanding humanity's failures and glories. And in teaching, James believed that each student had their own internal battle, and he was there to help them win it. The students always noticed something different about him. He wasn't a teacher who hid behind formality, but someone who genuinely cared about their stories. When other teachers finished their classes and left the room, James always stayed a little longer, asking the students how they were doing if something was worrying them. Many times he would sit next to them informally, listening attentively to concerns that went far beyond academic questions. It was a simple gesture, but one that made all the difference. In one of those conversations, James was talking to Clara, a visibly distressed student. She mentioned that she was having difficulties at home, which made her lose concentration in class. He listened patiently, not only offering advice but also suggesting ways to balance her studies with family problems. James always said that mental well-being was as important as performance on exams, and he made sure to remind his students of this frequently. James' classroom was not just a place for studying. On the walls, ancient maps and posters of historical figures shared space with inspiring phrases he himself wrote. "History teaches us to be resilient," said one of them. He wanted his students to understand that just as great leaders had overcome challenges, they could too. And perhaps at that moment, that was what mattered most to James, showing that each of them had the strength to face their own battles. But what really set James apart was his presence during recess. While many teachers used the break to rest in the staff room, James preferred to walk around the yard. He observed the groups of students attentively. He knew that often, it was there, away from the adult gaze, that tensions between students arose. He saw when someone was being excluded, when a cruel word was spoken. And whenever possible, he subtly intervened, often with a friendly conversation or a simple change of subject. One day, a group of students approached him during recess, laughing about an assignment he had given. They mentioned jokingly how his classes were different, less boring. He laughed along, but he knew that the comment hid a compliment. He knew that, for them, history class was more than memorizing facts. They felt part of the narrative, as if the stories he told could also be theirs. When the bell rang, signaling the end of another school day, James was usually the last to leave. He gathered his papers calmly, looking around to make sure no one had been left behind. For him, each student had their own time, their own way of processing what had been taught, and he was in no hurry to leave. He knew that for some, school was more than a place of study, it was a refuge, and he made sure they felt safe there. The connection he created with the students went beyond the school. Many times he received emails or handwritten notes, thanking him for advice or simply for being there. For James, that was true success. Not formal recognition or the good grades his students achieved, but the transformation he saw in each of them over the course of the year. Noah was one of those students who could go unnoticed in the crowd. He always chose seats in the back of the class, hoping that the attentive gaze of the teachers wouldn't fall on him. He came from a humble family, very different from most of his classmates at that prestigious school, where luxury and heritage seemed to define the value of each student. The impeccable uniform he wore hid the patches on his clothes, carefully ironed by his mother so that he wouldn't stand out for the wrong reasons. His life at school was a silent battle. While other students talked about vacation trips to exotic places and expensive lunches at famous restaurants, Noah listened in silence. He never had the courage to share the simple stories of his life, of a modest home and the small joys he and his family experienced. It wasn't just a matter of shyness, it was a constant feeling of inadequacy, as if he didn't belong to that world of excess. In the first weeks of school, he still tried to fit in with small timid gestures, like a quick laugh at others' jokes or a quiet comment during conversations at recess. But no matter how hard he tried, he always seemed out of sync. The laughter, the sideways glances, the conversations that stopped when he approached. All of this gradually suffocated his courage. Noah began to understand that, in that place, he would never be truly accepted. The school corridors became mazes for Noah. He moved through them like a ghost, avoiding groups, choosing the right moments to pass unnoticed. Unlike the others who walked with confidence, Noah kept his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he wanted to occupy as little space as possible. In that golden universe of wealth and status, his presence seemed like an intruder he tried to hide at all costs. Noah did not stand out academically. His grades were average, just enough not to attract attention, neither positive nor negative. What he most desired was to go through the days unnoticed, as if invisibility were a protection against the constant judgment he felt around him. His classmates' lively conversation sounded like a foreign language to him, one he would never be part of. On some days, Noah would watch from afar as groups of friends interacted, silently wishing he could be like them, blend in and be part of that dynamic that seemed so natural to the others. But the more he observed, the clearer it became that he was different. Not in appearance but in what he didn't have. And what he didn't have was the privilege of an easy life, of a childhood surrounded by abundance. Deep down, he knew that this difference was what kept him apart. In the classroom, he rarely raised his hand. When teachers asked questions, Noah shrank into his chair, hoping not to be called on. He feared being wrong, but he feared even more getting it right and somehow attracting attention he didn't want. It was as if every gesture, every word, could be another reason for people to remember that he didn't belong there. On the rare occasions when his classmates spoke to him, there was a clear distance. The words were often polite, but tinged with a subtle condescension, as if they were talking to someone they didn't see as an equal. Noah felt this even though they never said it out loud. He knew deep down that his presence there was an anomaly to them, an uncomfortable reminder that not everyone came from the same world. Noah would come home exhausted, not just from the schoolwork, but from the constant tension of trying to be someone he wasn't. His mother, always affectionate, would ask about his day, and he would respond with a forced smile, saying that everything was fine. She never needed to know what he faced every day. To her, Noah was a hero for studying at such a prestigious school. And he clung to that image his mother had of him, even though inside the feeling of being lost grew stronger every day. Inside Noah, the struggle was ongoing. The desire to fit in, to be accepted, competed with the harsh reality that, to those around him, he would always be the boy who came from another place. And so, in silence, he tried to survive each day, hoping that maybe something would change. Something that would finally make him feel that he, too, deserved to be there. Noah always arrived at school a little earlier, perhaps to avoid the long stares from classmates who started arriving later. James noticed this first, a subtle change in the behavior of the boy who once seemed only shy but now moved with a certain urgency to disappear through the classroom doors. He sat, as always, in the back, his shoulders even more hunched as if he wanted to hide. That's when James began to pay more attention. During one of his classes, he noticed a low murmur coming from the last row where Noah sat. A group of boys whispered something, then exchanged malicious glances. At first, it seemed like a common conversation between students, until a short, cruel laugh escaped, making Noah shrink further into his chair. The comments were quick, disguised as harmless jokes, but the way Noah stayed silent, trying to avoid any reaction, caught James' attention. The jokes continued, but Noah never complained. He kept his head down, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if each provocation was a small stab he tried to ignore. One day, James heard one of the students say something about second-hand clothes, followed by muffled laughter. Noah didn't react, but his face turned pale, and his fingers gripped the edge of the desk tightly. For James, it became clear that this was no longer just a simple joke among friends. In the yard, during recess, the situation repeated itself. Noah would walk across the grass toward a more isolated corner, while the other boys in a group watched him from afar. They made jokes aloud, saying things that seemed innocent at first glance but always carried a hint of cruelty. "Hey Noah, did you get that scholarship from the thrift store?" one of them said while the others laughed. It was subtle but cruel. They knew exactly how to target the boy without leaving obvious traces. James, observing from a distance, felt a pang in his chest. There was something in the way Noah walked, his shoulders tense and his gaze always turned to the ground, that deeply worried him. He saw how Noah avoided any eye contact, always choosing the exact moments to cross the yard without drawing attention. It was as if the boy had trained himself to be invisible, a skill only those who had been the target of cruelty learned to master. Noah, in silence, absorbed each of these words like a slow-acting poison. James could see it even though the boy never openly showed his suffering. The marks were there, invisible to most, but clear as day to those who knew how to look. The teacher began to be more vigilant, watching not only the words spoken but the looks, the gestures. Every stifled laugh echoing in the hallway seemed to make Noah shrink further, as if he were trying to escape a world that judged him mercilessly. One day, James approached Noah in the classroom, offering help on an assignment that seemed too simple to deserve such attention. He did this only to try to establish a connection to see if the boy would open up. But Noah, visibly uncomfortable, just nodded in thanks without lifting his eyes from the paper in front of him. There was something in that silence that hurt more than any words could express. The cruelty of the other students continued in almost imperceptible ways. It was an art, the way they ridiculed Noah without the teacher's hearing, always with a joke camouflaged behind a supposedly harmless comment. "You heard what he said? He's just kidding," they would say if questioned. But James knew it wasn't just a joke. He knew Noah was suffering in a way that couldn't be ignored. James began to feel powerless. Every day he witnessed small acts of exclusion, sharp words disguised as sarcasm. He knew Noah was trapped in a situation from which he couldn't escape on his own. With each passing day, the tension in the air grew, and James, now more aware than ever, knew he had to act. Something inside him told him he couldn't keep pretending those provocations were just harmless jokes. The school where James taught was an imposing institution, with white marble walls and perfectly maintained gardens, reflecting a quiet wealth and an almost palpable pride. Everything there seemed polished and orderly, from the rows of luxury cars parked at the entrance to the silent hallways decorated with trophies from academic and sports competitions. There was an image to be maintained, and every student, teacher, and staff member seemed to understand that the harmony of that facade was something unbreakable. The school's reputation was its greatest glory, something to be preserved at any cost. For the administration, the priority had always been clear. The school needed to be seen as an example of excellence. And that excellence was not only about academic performance but also about how the school was perceived by society. Any scandal, any minor incident that could tarnish this reputation, was handled with the utmost discretion, silence before it even reached the public's ears. It was a culture of control, where the image of the institution mattered more than any act of justice. The students, especially those who came from more influential families, seemed to understand this implicit game from an early age. For them, the rules were more flexible. The protection the school offered them was silent but evident. Any problem involving these young people, such as inappropriate behavior or a disciplinary issue, was quickly resolved behind the scenes. After all, no one wanted to draw the wrath of powerful parents or tarnish the name of an institution that prided itself so much on its tradition. The teachers in turn walked a fine line. The expectation was that they would keep the students in check but without creating waves that could disturb the artificial calm of the environment. The pressure was constant, though often subtle. James knew that in the teacher's room, the subject of problematic students or injustices that occurred in the hallways was rarely discussed openly. There was a shared fear that by questioning the school's practices, they themselves could be seen as part of the problem. "We are a prestigious institution," the principal would say at teacher meetings, her tone calm but firm. "And we must maintain that standard. Internal problems must be handled internally." James clearly remembered those words, spoken with a coldness he couldn't ignore. Anyone who tried to expose something that didn't fit this ideal would be quickly silenced. It was the unspoken rule that everyone there knew but few had the courage to challenge. James felt the tension of this culture in every meeting with the administration. Any attempt to bring a sensitive issue up for debate was met with cautious looks, as if merely talking about a problem could create a stain that would be hard to remove. "We can't let this get out," he once heard from one of the coordinators when a case of discrimination came to light. The response wasn't surprising. In that school, covering up a problem always seemed more important than solving it. There was a heavy silence that hung over the institution, a curtain that hid reality to protect reputation. When a more vulnerable student was harmed, like in Noah's case, the suffering wasn't ignored out of ignorance but out of convenience. To the school, students like Noah, who didn't come from influential families, were seen more as statistics than as people. And if problems arose, the administration didn't hesitate to turn a blind eye, as long as the important parties weren't affected. The pressure on the teachers was immense. They knew they needed to deliver results, students passing, high grades, events that reinforced the school's prestige. At the same time, they had to balance this with the reality that often justice didn't exist for everyone within the school. Those who dared to raise ethical issues or defend more vulnerable students were quickly reminded of their place. The career of any teacher there depended on their ability to maintain calm, even in the face of injustice. James felt this pressure every time he saw Noah, isolated and struggling to survive in that merciless environment. He knew that the school expected him to turn a blind eye, to maintain the facade of normalcy. But over time, that expectation began to weigh on his conscience. He was a teacher who believed in education as a tool for transformation, but the school seemed to use education only as a means to perpetuate inequality. Each day the tension grew. Something inside James told him that he couldn't continue pretending he didn't see. And eventually he knew he would have to make a choice. The afternoon sun warmed the schoolyard, where students spread out in small groups, talking and laughing loudly. James walked at a distance, his eyes always attentive to the details that other teachers overlooked. It was then that, from afar, he saw Noah, isolated as usual, with tense shoulders. At the same moment, a group of older students approached, laughing at something Noah had said, but the laughter had a cutting sharpness that James immediately recognized. Noah kept his head down, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to walk past his classmates without being noticed, but he didn't succeed. One of the boys, wearing an impeccable blazer and an arrogant posture, blocked his way. "Hey Noah, aren't you going to say anything about your vacation?" "Oh wait, you didn't go anywhere, did you?" The sentence, spoken with false innocence, drew laughter from the others. Noah tried to walk past, but another boy not so subtly pushed his shoulder, forcing him to stay in the center of the circle. James felt his blood boil. The yard, which had seemed serene a moment before, now turned into an arena of cruelty. The provocations escalated. "Careful, he might stain your uniform," said one of the students, pushing Noah to the other side. The young boy stumbled, almost fell, but remained upright. Noah's face was red with shame, but he didn't react. He never reacted. For the others, this was an invitation to continue. They knew Noah would never complain, never cause trouble. At that moment, James decided to act. He crossed the yard with firm steps, without hesitation, his heart pounding. "Enough!" His voice cut through the air, making the aggressors turn to him with surprised looks. James placed himself between Noah and the students, his body tense, one hand raised as if it were a shield. "This ends now," he said, his tone firm but controlled, leaving no room for discussion. The students were silent for a moment, confused, perhaps even irritated at being interrupted. The leader of the group, a boy with neatly combed hair and an air of superiority, smiled slightly as if he were in on a joke. "We were just joking, Professor. It's nothing serious." The phrase, disguised as innocence, made James grit his teeth. He looked at Noah, who now seemed to shrink behind him, his eyes fixed on the ground, and knew he couldn't let this go. "Joking? Is that what you call this?" James shot back, his eyes blazing with indignation. The crowd around them began to form, with the other students realizing that something out of the ordinary was happening. The tension was palpable in the air, each word heavy like an important decision. James knew that by intervening he was going against the school's unspoken rules, but at that moment, nothing else mattered. Justice had to be served right there in front of everyone. The leader of the boys shrugged, still with a sarcastic smile. "He's just he started to say, but James cut him off. "He's a student just like you, and he deserves respect. If you think humiliating someone is fun, then you've learned the wrong thing about what it means to be decent." The silence that followed was profound. The other students watching seemed surprised, some uncomfortable. James wasn't just talking to the aggressors. He was exposing the cruelty that everyone knew existed but few had the courage to confront. James turned to Noah, who now looked at him with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Noah nodded slowly, still without words, but his eyes said everything. In that moment, something changed. Noah was no longer alone. Someone had seen, someone had done something. But James knew it wouldn't end there. When he looked at the group of aggressors again, he saw the barely disguised anger on the boys' faces. It wouldn't be easy to face the consequences of what he had just done, but in that instant, under the scorching sun of the yard, he made a decision. He would never go back. This was just the beginning of a battle he knew he would have to fight. James was summoned to a meeting with the administration at the end of a quiet morning. The message was brief and to the point, with no further explanations. "Report to the principal's office immediately." He knew it was related to the confrontation in the yard the previous day, but he wasn't prepared for what was coming. Walking through the hallways, he felt a knot in his throat, a mix of apprehension and indignation. He had done the right thing, protecting Noah from an unjust attack. There was no way he could be punished for that, he thought. The principal's office was spacious, decorated with awards and certificates that highlighted the prestige of the institution. Upon entering, James was met with cold stares. Seated at the table were the principal, 2 members of the school board, and the disciplinary coordinator. The atmosphere was heavy with formality, and the tension was palpable. "Please sit, Mr. Cooper," the principal said in a controlled tone, masking the storm that was about to come. James sat down, but his body remained tense, as if he already knew something was wrong. The principal began speaking in a soft, almost rehearsed manner. "We are aware of yesterday's incident in the yard. We've been informed that you intervened in a situation involving some of our students." James, who had initially entered with confidence, now felt the weight of her words. Something in the way she phrased the sentences indicated that this conversation wasn't about justice but rather about damage control. He opened his mouth to try to explain, but was interrupted. "We understand that your intentions were good," the principal continued, carefully choosing her words. "However, your behavior was inappropriate. Here at the school, we have a very clear policy on how to handle conflicts between students. Your intervention was seen as impulsive, and that put the harmony of the school environment at risk." James blinked, incredulous. "Putting the harmony at risk?" "I stopped an aggression," he replied, trying to remain calm but feeling his voice waver. The disciplinary coordinator, a man with a serious expression and an impenetrable demeanor, took the floor. "The issue isn't what you did, James, but how you did it. You directly confronted the students and created a situation that could have escalated. Moreover, we are dealing with children from influential families. These situations need to be handled with more delicacy." The word delicacy felt like an insult disguised as advice. James felt the anger bubbling in his stomach but tried to take a deep breath. "Delicacy?" he said, his voice now tinged with disbelief. "These students were publicly humiliating Noah, and you call me in here to talk about delicacy? Justice isn't a matter of convenience." The principal's expression hardened. "Here, Mr. Cooper, we have an image to uphold. This kind of behavior, especially with students whose families financially support the school, must be handled with more discretion." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. The injustice was glaringly obvious. The silence that followed was suffocating. James looked around the table, searching for some sign of support, but found only impassive faces, committed to protecting the status quo. "So, that's it," he said finally, his voice a whisper, heavy with bitterness. "You'd rather protect the oppressors than defend the students who most need protection?" The principal maintained her composure, as if she were used to dealing with such reactions. "This is how we operate, Mr. Cooper. We hope you understand." But James didn't understand. And in that moment, the truth hit him hard. The school didn't care about justice or the well-being of students like Noah. For them, all that mattered was maintaining the flawless facade. The principal continued talking, but James barely heard her. The words were just a distant echo. The brutal reality of the situation was now clear to him. The shock of injustice hit him overwhelmingly, like a storm he could never have predicted. James entered the principal's office with a faint hope, still believing that there might be some kind of solution. He knew that the previous meeting had been a warning, but he had not imagined that things could take the course they were about to follow. As he sat down in front of the principal and the board members, something in the atmosphere seemed different. The air was heavier, the expressions colder. And then, without any preamble, the principal announced the decision. "Professor Cooper, after long deliberation, we have decided that your recent conduct was inappropriate for the standards of our institution. From today, you are dismissed from your duties." The words fell like a direct blow to James' chest. He remained motionless, trying to process what he had just heard. The silence that followed was brutal. "Dismissed?" he murmured, more to himself than to those present. "For defending a student who was being humiliated?" The principal folded her hands on the table, her expression unchanged. "We understand that you were trying to help, but the way you handled the situation compromised the school's image. And unfortunately, we cannot tolerate that." James felt a wave of indignation mixed with deep sadness. This was the school where he had invested years of his life, believing that he was shaping young minds for the future. However, now, the institution that should have valued justice and education was choosing to protect the aggressors, maintaining a facade of prestige at any cost. The feeling of betrayal was overwhelming. "You are firing me for doing what was right?" he said, his voice hoarse with frustration. "It's not that simple, Cooper," interrupted one of the board members, with a coldness that only intensified the absurdity of the situation. "Our priority is maintaining order and reputation. Your action created unnecessary tension among the students and, more importantly, among the families who invest in the school. Unfortunately, there is no room for impulsiveness." Each word was like distilled poison, and James knew that any argument would be in vain. Those men and women were determined to sacrifice the truth in the name of convenience. He stood up slowly, feeling an enormous weight on his shoulders, as if the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. For a brief moment, James thought about fighting, raising his voice, but something inside him stopped him. It was as if he had reached an invisible barrier of exhaustion, of disillusionment. "Very well," he said with a forced calmness, his eyes burning with a controlled anger. "I hope that one day you understand what truly matters. But I will not be complicit in an institution that prefers silence over justice." He left the room with firm steps, but the world around him seemed to have lost its colors. The hallways he had passed through so many times now felt cold, hostile. The gazes of some students followed him as he walked out of the school, unaware of what was happening. At that moment, he felt the weight of a bitter defeat. He had not only lost his job but also his belief in the institution that he thought represented something greater. When he reached the door of his classroom for the last time, James stopped. The materials were still on the desk, the blackboard marked with notes from the previous lesson. Looking around, he saw the empty desks and the window that let in the soft afternoon light. That place, which had always been his sanctuary, was now just a memory. He silently gathered his belongings, feeling the weight of the responsibility he carried for all the Noahs who still needed to be protected. As he exited through the school gate, the cold wind of reality hit him in a different way. He had fought for truth and justice, but he had paid the highest price. His mind spun in search of answers, of a meaning for what had happened. But the only thing he felt at that moment was the pain of betrayal. The school, which should have been a place of protection and learning, had chosen the easiest path: silence and denial. James walked away, knowing that his journey was far from over but without knowing exactly what the next step would be. The sound of the doorbell ringing pulled James out of his dark thoughts. It had been days since his dismissal, and he was still struggling to accept what had happened. When he opened the door, the last person he expected to see was Noah. The boy stood there, looking defeated, his hands trembling slightly as he held the strap of his backpack. His eyes, always carrying a silent sadness, now revealed a desperation that James had never seen before. "Can I come in?" Noah asked, his voice barely a whisper. James stepped aside, letting the boy pass without saying a word. Noah entered the small living room, looking even smaller than usual, shrinking under the weight of an invisible pressure. As he sat on the couch, his hands gripped his knees as if trying to gather the strength to speak. James sat in front of him, waiting with a heavy heart. I don't know what to do," Noah began, his voice breaking. "After you left, everything got worse. They won't stop, and now I don't even have anyone to turn to." The words came out choppy, full of anguish. Noah was visibly shaken, as if he was on the verge of collapsing. James looked at him with empathy, feeling a deep pain as he realized how much the boy was suffering. Noah had not only lost a teacher but also the only adult who seemed to genuinely care about him in that hostile environment. James tried to remain calm, but his mind was racing in many directions. He knew that, at that moment, what Noah needed most was an anchor, someone who could guide him back to the surface from where he was sinking. "I'm sorry, Noah," James said, his voice firm but filled with compassion. "I failed you. I couldn't protect you as I should have." Noah shook his head, his eyes full of tears. "No, you did what you could, but now I'm alone. And I can't take it anymore." Noah's words were like a knife plunged into James' heart. The boy, who had always tried to go unnoticed, who had endured so many provocations in silence, was now on the brink of collapse. And James knew he couldn't leave him like this. Even without his position as a teacher, he couldn't turn his back on Noah. The mission to protect and guide that boy and so many others like him didn't end with a work contract. It was something much bigger, something that beat in his chest with uncontrollable force. "Noah, you're not alone," James said firmly, leaning forward. "I know it seems impossible right now, but there's a way out. We'll find a way to overcome this together." Noah looked at him, trying to believe in the words, trying to cling to the promise that something could change. "But what can we do? They have all the power and we have nothing." His voice, broken by pain, exposed the fear he carried. James took a deep breath. He knew the system was against them, that the school and its elitist structure protected the privileged while ignoring the vulnerable. But he also knew that he couldn't give up. "Maybe they have the power at school, but they don't have everything, Noah. Sometimes what seems like our biggest obstacle can show us a new path." Noah frowned, confused, but a spark of hope began to shine in his eyes. He trusted James. He always had. The silence that followed was laden with strange tension, but also with mutual understanding. James knew he was on the verge of an important decision, something that would go beyond the simple act of teaching in a classroom. Noah needed more than advice. He needed real support, a space where he could feel valued, where his voice would be heard. And James was beginning to realize that, to truly help Noah, he would have to create something new, something that went beyond the walls of that school that had betrayed them. "I have an idea, Noah," James said, his gaze determined. "It may not be easy, but together we can build something. Something that not only helps you but also many other kids who are going through the same situation." Noah looked at him, a mixture of doubt and hope on his face. "What do you mean?" James smiled, a small smile but filled with conviction. "I'll tell you, But first, you need to believe that the future can be different. James spent hours that night reflecting, sitting in his armchair, staring at the ceiling while the weight of the last few days crushed him. He knew he couldn't simply accept the injustice he had witnessed and, even worse, experienced. Noah wasn't the only boy who would need support. The school was full of young people like him, invisible to the administration, ignored by a system that only valued prestige. It was in that agonizing silence that the idea arose, clearer than ever before, to create a community center, a safe place where these young people could learn, grow, and above all, feel seen. The idea seemed audacious, almost impossible, but James couldn't get it out of his mind. He envisioned a space where boys and girls like Noah could receive educational and emotional support, where the social barriers that imprison them would be broken. It wouldn't just be a place to learn history or math, but a refuge for those who lived on the margins. Something that transcended traditional teaching and became a true community, full of care and solidarity. The next morning, while drinking a bitter cup of coffee, James began sketching out the plan in an old notebook. The pages filled up with loose ideas, possibilities for classes, self-esteem workshops, and debates on social justice. He thought about the skills he could teach, but also about how to empower the students to believe in themselves. With each scribbled word, he saw a way to correct what the school had failed to offer. A space where a student's value would not be determined by their background, but by their potential. In the following days, the idea began to take shape more clearly. James walked through the neighborhood, observing abandoned buildings, thinking about how one of them could be transformed into the center he imagined. He saw the children playing in the streets, many of them with the same look Noah used to have, a mix of innocence and fear, as if the world was about to collapse on them at any moment. James knew that for those children, the community center would not just be a classroom, it would be a beacon of hope. The memory of Noah motivated him. Every time he thought about the boy, about how he struggled not to be noticed, James felt the urgency to do something that could change that reality. He could no longer wait for the system to act. He knew that the school would continue to protect those at the top while ignoring those most in need of help. But now, free from institutional constraints, he could act in the way he had always wanted, with freedom and purpose. James shared the idea with some people close to him, and, as expected, the reactions were mixed. Some thought the proposal was too idealistic, almost naive. A community center? And you're going to do this alone? The question echoed in James' mind, but he had already decided. Yes, he would do it alone if necessary. Others, however, saw something powerful in his plan. He felt a renewed warmth upon realizing that, despite the difficulties, some people understood what he was trying to build. Noah was one of the first to hear the full plan. When James told him about the idea of a center where young people like him could gather, learn, and strengthen themselves, Noah's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and disbelief. That would be incredible, Professor, Noah said, his voice filled with emotion. James nodded, feeling more confident. And you'll be part of this, Noah? We'll build it together. Each time James spoke about the community center, he felt that he was getting closer to something bigger, something that could finally change the course of so many young lives who, like Noah, had been left on the margins. He knew it wouldn't be easy, nothing important ever is. But for the first time since his dismissal, he felt in control of his own destiny. And, more importantly, he felt that he was on the verge of making a difference. The community center was still just an idea, a concept scribbled in old notebooks and conversations shared with those who cared. But for James, it was already real. He could feel the energy of that place, the voices of the students echoing through the rooms, the change it would bring to every life it touched. And now, with the plan clear in his mind and Noah by his side, he was ready to turn that idea into something concrete. A new chance for those who had never had one before. James didn't imagine that the beginning would be so difficult. The first weeks after deciding to create the community center were full of fruitless meetings and doors that closed before he could even finish explaining his idea. When he tried to talk to some local business people, he was met with skeptical looks, as if his project were an unrealizable utopia. A community center? Free education? In times like these? They shook their heads, incredulous. To many, helping young people from humble origins seemed like an investment with no return. As the days passed, James found himself fighting against something much larger than the lack of money. He was facing indifference. With each meeting where his idea was dismissed, with each phone call that went unanswered, he felt the weight of a system that preferred to keep things as they were. Even among the parents of students who he thought would understand his cause, the response was lukewarm. They were more concerned with their own day-to-day struggles than with supporting a community project. James began to question whether he could really do this alone. The following days were a true marathon. James spent hours in his small apartment, typing letters, writing emails, trying to get support from anywhere. He reached out to NGOs, foundations, and even people who had been his colleagues. However, the answer was always the same: skepticism. Without a solid financial plan, James, no one is going to invest in this, they said. You have your heart in the right place, but you need more than passion to make this work. Each rejection seemed to erode a little of his confidence. One afternoon, after yet another meeting where he left empty-handed, James sat on a park bench, exhausted. He looked around and saw children running, playing barefoot in the park. In their laughter, he saw what was at stake. It wasn't just about building a physical space, but about offering an opportunity for these children to have a different future. He took a deep breath, remembering Noah, and with a new surge of determination, he promised himself that he would not give up. If he needed to knock on 100 more doors, he would. With the little money he had saved, James decided to take the first step by renting a small, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was in terrible condition: peeling walls, broken windows, dust everywhere. It was the opposite of what he had imagined, but it was what he could afford. When Noah saw the place for the first time, his eyes widened in surprise. "We're going to start here?" he asked hesitantly. James smiled, but the insecurity was palpable in his voice. "This is where it all starts, Noah. It may not be much, but it's enough for those who need it." The first big challenge was getting basic materials. James needed desks, books, boards, everything. He began scouring thrift stores, flea markets, and donation sites. Many times he came home empty-handed, but at other times he managed to find small treasures. An old bookshelf here, a box of used books there. Little by little, the warehouse began to resemble something that could eventually be called a classroom. Noah, always by his side, helped as much as he could, and his determination was contagious to James. Even with all the difficulties, something was beginning to take shape. However, the hardest part was dealing with the lack of support from the local community itself. Many didn't trust the project, thinking it was just another empty promise, like so many they had heard before. Some neighbors openly questioned his intentions. "What do you want with this? Don't you think public schools already do enough?" they asked skeptically. But James knew it wasn't just about formal education. It was about providing care, dignity, and opportunity. And although those words sounded abstract to many, he continued to believe in them. There were nights when James wondered if he was on the right path. He looked at the empty warehouse, at the few materials he had managed to gather, and doubt consumed him. But every time he saw the spark in Noah's eyes when talking about the project, every time he heard the growing enthusiasm in the boy about the future they could build together, something inside him reignited. Noah was living proof that this effort had value. And it was for all the Noahs out there that James needed to keep going, no matter how hard the road became. Despite the numerous obstacles, James' vision for the community center never disappeared. He knew he was planting seeds in difficult soil, but he also knew that with time and persistence, those seeds would grow. Every new challenge was an opportunity to prove that true change doesn't happen easily or quickly, but with resilience. The first sign that something was changing came on an ordinary day, when James, already accustomed to difficulties, received an unexpected visitor. It was Mrs. Clara, an elderly woman from the neighborhood, known for her crafting skills. "I heard about what you're doing for the kids," she said, holding a basket of colorful fabric scraps. "I don't have much, but I can help make curtains and cover those broken windows. That way the place will feel more welcoming." James smiled, surprised and emotional. It was a small gesture, but to him it meant the world. It was the first indication that his fight was being noticed. Word of the community center began to spread, from mouth to mouth, through the alleys and streets of the city. It wasn't a grand story, nor did it carry political promises, but it was authentic. People started to notice what James was trying to build. A place where their children could find safety, learning, and, above all, dignity. Gradually, more neighbors began to offer their help. A man named Jorge, who had a tool shop, showed up one day and offered his time to fix the doors and windows. "I see what you're trying to do, James," he said with a look of approval. "And I respect that." With the arrival of Jorge and Mrs. Clara, the community center truly began to come to life. The walls, once bare and gray, began to be painted with vibrant colors, thanks to some cans of paint donated by a local merchant. "These colors will cheer up the kids," he said, laughing. The warehouse that once seemed abandoned was slowly transforming into a space full of hope. Noah, watching everything closely, helped paint the walls with an enthusiasm that James had never seen in him before. The donations didn't stop there. A neighborhood restaurant began sending simple meals on the days when activities took place at the center. "The kids need to eat well to learn," commented the owner while unloading boxes of hot meals. The smell of fresh food filled the air, and James found himself smiling, deeply moved. Things were finally changing. The help came in small doses, but it was genuine. And with each new gesture of solidarity, the community center began to take shape, not just physically but also gaining a soul. Soon, the parents of the community began to show up as well. Some, curious, brought their children to see the space. Others came just to observe, still skeptical. "Is this really going to be free?" they asked incredulously. James received them with patience, explaining his vision and the importance of a place where all children were welcome, regardless of their backgrounds. And little by little, those parents began to trust, to see that the community center was more than just a utopian idea, it was a real chance for change. However, it wasn't just material help that transformed the center. Neighbors began to offer what they knew best. A woman who taught dance classes proposed starting a class for the young people. "They need to express themselves to loosen up," she said, already full of energy. A retired man, a former science teacher, offered to give simple physics workshops using recycled materials. Creativity blossomed from all corners, and James watched in awe as the project came to life, driven by collective strength. The community, which had once viewed him with suspicion, now embraced him. The community center was no longer a solitary dream. It was becoming a true point of unity. The children ran through the warehouse, laughing and experiencing a space that was now theirs. They felt that they had a place there, that they belonged to something bigger. And for James, that was the greatest achievement. The sound of children's laughter echoing through the newly painted walls was proof that he was on the right path. One quiet afternoon, while James was organizing donated books on an improvised bookshelf, he paused for a moment to take in everything around him. The sun streamed through the windows with colorful curtains, the sound of Jorge's tools still echoed, and the children were playing with Noah, who now seemed to be the center of a group of laughter. For a moment, he realized that the community center was not just a refuge. It was a seed of real, tangible change, a symbol that solidarity could transform lives. As night fell, while locking the center's gate for the last time that day, James looked up at the stars, feeling a deep sense of relief. The journey had been tough, but finally he was no longer alone. Noah was no longer the silent, withdrawn boy who had first walked through the door of the community center. Something inside him had started to change over the months. The space, once seen as James' desperate attempt to help those on the margins, had now become a place where Noah found his voice. Instead of hiding in the corners, he began to walk the halls with a newfound confidence. His eyes, once always downcast, now faced the world with determination. The community center had become the place where, for the first time, he felt accepted. There, he was not the poor boy or the easy target. He was Noah, someone with skills, strength, and, surprisingly, leadership. He started helping James with small daily tasks, organizing materials, talking to the younger kids, and, little by little, earning the respect and admiration of everyone. The other kids, who at first saw him just as an older classmate, now watched him with curiosity. There was something about him that drew them in, a quiet strength, almost contagious. It was on a busy afternoon, while James was preoccupied with registering new students, that Noah took his first big step as a leader. A group of younger children had gathered, unsure of what to do, their voices low, filled with insecurity. Noah approached them, a little hesitant at first but determined. "Hey, how about we build something together?" he suggested, pointing to a box full of recyclable materials. The children looked at him, suspicious at first, but soon they began to follow him. From that moment on, Noah was no longer just a student, he was an inspiration. Over time, Noah began telling his own story to the others. He spoke, without shame, of the difficulties he had faced at school, of how he felt alone and hopeless. But as he spoke, his eyes sparkled, and he didn't hesitate to say that the community center had saved him. "Here, I learned that I'm not defined by what others think of me," he said, with a confidence that impressed even James. And for the other kids, hearing those words from someone like Noah made all the difference. Soon, the younger ones started seeking out Noah whenever they had doubts or problems. He helped them with patience, always remembering the words James had told him so many times: "You are capable. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Noah now passed on that message to others, showing that, like him, they could find their value and strength, even in the most adverse situations. The cycle of insecurity that had once imprisoned him had been broken, and now he was helping others do the same. James watched all this from afar with silent but deep pride. Seeing Noah blossom like that was confirmation that the community center was fulfilling its purpose. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but every smile, every act of leadership that Noah displayed, was a victory over the darkness from which he had escaped. The boy who once avoided any attention was now at the center of the activities, helping to guide others along the path he had traveled. One day, while Noah was leading an art workshop with the children, James approached, crossing his arms and smiling. "You're doing a great job, Noah," he said, watching the boy as he explained how to use the materials. Noah looked at James, the glow of newfound confidence evident in his eyes. "I learned from the best," he replied, and the two shared a moment of deep understanding. They didn't need many words to recognize how far they had come together. Noah's transformation was quick, but genuine. He had gone from victim to mentor, from someone who hid in the shadows to an example of overcoming adversity. The children admired him, the parents praised him, and James, now more than ever, believed that the work they were doing at the community center could change the lives of many more. Noah was no longer just a survivor, he was a leader. And seeing the impact that had on the lives around him, James knew that this was only the beginning. Noah's rebirth was a testament not only to the power of resilience but also to the importance of creating spaces where people could find themselves, grow, and thrive. He went from being a shy boy whose voice was silenced by oppression, to someone who now had his own voice, and that voice echoed through the corridors of the community center, inspiring others to find theirs. The news about the community center began to spread in a quiet way at first. It was just a rumor among local residents, a whisper about that teacher who was fired and the place he created to help the kids. But one day, a young journalist from a local newspaper heard about the project. Curious, she decided to visit the center and see for herself what was happening. When she arrived, she was greeted by James, who, with his usual calm, explained the reason behind everything. The journalist observed silently as she watched Noah leading a group of young people in a reading workshop. The transformation was palpable. The journalist was impressed by what she saw. It wasn't just a story about a teacher who refused to accept injustice, but about a community coming together to build something new and powerful. She took photos, made notes, and at the end of the interview with James, she looked at him with a sparkle in her eyes. "People need to know about this," she said. "It's not just about what you did, James. It's about what everyone is doing together." When the article came out, it had a bigger impact than James could have ever imagined. The title read, "The teacher who turned his dismissal into hope for the young." The photos showed the smiling children, the colorful walls of the community center, and an image of Noah, now confident, surrounded by other young people. James' story, his fight against injustice, his dismissal, and his decision not to give up, deeply touched the local community. The article spread quickly, and soon other media outlets became interested. From then on, the story took on a life of its own. Local radio and TV programs began highlighting James' work, and soon he was invited for interviews. Sitting in makeshift studios, he told the same story, but each time he repeated it, more emotion came through. "I just wanted to give these kids what the school failed to offer. A place where they feel valued," he said. Each time he spoke about Noah, about how the boy had transformed, the interviewers were visibly moved. The strength of the project lay not only in its intentions but in its results. Soon, the community center was receiving donations from places James never imagined. Local businesses sent school supplies, volunteers appeared to offer their time, and the once empty spaces in the warehouse began to fill with life and energy. Everyone who read or heard James and Noah's story felt like they were witnessing something rare, a real change happening from the ground up. James, though humbly grateful, felt the weight of this attention. He knew that now the center was bigger than him, it was a symbol of resistance and renewal. On one particularly busy afternoon, Noah pulled James aside. "Professor, did you see what they're saying on TV?" He was holding his phone, showing a news report where journalists mentioned the community center as a beacon of hope in difficult times. James laughed, but there was something in his eyes, a mixture of pride and caution. He knew that with so much visibility, greater challenges would also come. However, at that moment, everything seemed to be on the right track. The media, enchanted by Noah's transformation, began to follow him closely. They interviewed the boy, showing the public how he had gone from a victim of bullying to a leader at the community center. Noah spoke with humility, but every word resonated with strength. He had become a symbol of overcoming adversity, and his interviews moved the viewers. For many, he was living proof that, with support and opportunity, any young person could flourish regardless of their circumstances. James watched all of this with a warm heart. He had never sought fame, but the media attention brought a new wave of support and resources. The community center was growing, both in structure and in significance. But the most important thing for him was to see the lives being transformed. And in every hopeful look, in every smile of a child who felt safe there, he saw the result of what began as an almost impossible dream. The cameras captured everything: the smiles, the conversations, the joy that spread through the corridors of the community center. But what they couldn't capture was the beating heart of that place, the dedication, the resilience, and the courage of a community that, little by little, was rising. And at the center of it all was James, humble as always, watching from a distance as something he had started with almost empty hands now flourished like never before. The criticism started discreetly, almost whispered, in the corners of staff rooms and the luxurious halls of the school where James had once worked. But as the story of his community center gained strength, those low voices became loud cries that echoed beyond the school's gates. The parents, once loyal defenders of the school's prestige and impeccable reputation, began to question the administration's integrity. How could they fire a teacher who only wanted to protect the students? They asked in group chats and at parent-teacher meetings. The murmurs intensified when the local press began drawing parallels between James' dismissal and the impact he was making at the community center. It was impossible to ignore the narrative taking shape. A teacher wronged in silence for defending what was right, now transforming lives, while the school, which should have done the same, remained silent in the face of bullying. The headlines posed direct and uncomfortable questions. Why did such a prestigious institution choose to protect its image rather than its students? The school's board found itself cornered. In closed-door meetings, they discussed ways to manage the damage, but it was already too late. The local media, which had once praised the school as one of the best in the region, now eagerly explored its flaws. James' name was mentioned repeatedly in the reports, not as the fired teacher, but as the mentor behind a social transformation that the school itself should have encouraged. The pressure was palpable, and the administration was starting to falter. Within the Parents' Council, a growing tension developed week after week. Some parents, especially those whose children belonged to the most influential families, tried to divert attention, claiming that the school was only protecting its reputation. But the critical voices were louder. "Reputation?" said one mother, visibly emotional during one of the meetings. "And what about children like Noah? Who protected them? What are we teaching our kids?" These questions resonated, and many parents began to reconsider their position. Meanwhile, James followed all of this with a mix of surprise and concern. His intention was never to bring down the school or expose its failures to the world. His only goal had always been to protect Noah and others like him. But now, he saw how his personal struggle was triggering a turning point that no one could have predicted. The school's criticism became a reflection of a larger critique, a system that had long favored the strong while leaving the vulnerable behind. Under pressure from the news reports and growing dissatisfaction from parents, the school's administration finally decided to act. An emergency meeting was called, and the principal, once so sure of her decisions, now appeared hesitant. "We need to respond in some way," suggested one of the board members. "James' work is gaining visibility, and our reputation is at stake." But the truth was, it was no longer about saving their reputation. It was about correcting a wrong that should never have happened. It was then that the school, under heavy pressure, issued a public statement, something it rarely did. The statement acknowledged errors in judgment in the case of James Cooper and promised a review of the school's anti-bullying policies. Although the statement was vague and carefully worded, it represented an admission that, yes, the school had failed. However, for many, it sounded like a desperate attempt to contain the damage already done. It wasn't enough. The impact of James' work could no longer be ignored. The school's flaws were exposed in a way that even the strictest administration could not control. The students who had once feared repercussions for speaking out about bullying began to open up, encouraged by Noah's narrative. Small groups of students organized themselves to demand changes, asking for more protection and support for vulnerable students. The school, which had once prided itself on its controlled silence, was now being challenged by voices that refused to be silenced. The irony of all this did not escape James. The same system that had rejected him was now on its knees, confronted by the very failures he had tried to correct. But instead of feeling satisfaction, he felt only a deep sense of fulfillment. His work at the community center wasn't just about teaching or welcoming, it was about showing that change is possible, even when it seems impossible. The community center James had built flourished more than he could have imagined. The small warehouse that had once been improvised was now a vibrant, lively space, full of young people who found more than just a chance to learn there. They found hope. Noah, who had transformed from a shy student into a leader, continued to inspire other young people, showing them that, regardless of their circumstances, they could rise up and fight for their dreams. The community, once hesitant, now saw the center as a symbol of resistance and renewal. On the other hand, the school faced a time of profound change. The pressure from the media and the families forced the administration to re-evaluate its practices. New anti-bullying policies were implemented, and discussions on inclusion, respect, and empathy began to take up space in parent-teacher meetings. The school, which had once ignored the problems in the name of reputation, was now forced to confront its mistakes. Although it wasn't an immediate transformation, the seeds of change had been planted, and much of that was due to James' work. One afternoon, James sat in the community center's courtyard, watching the children run and play in the soft light of the late afternoon. Beside him, Noah approached and sat down in silence, the two of them observing the scene before them. "You did this, Professor," Noah said with a calm smile. James looked at the boy, who was now a strong and confident young man, and gently shook his head. "No, Noah, we did this, and we still have much more to do." The future was uncertain, but he knew that together, they could face any challenge. James Cooper's legacy wasn't just in the walls of the community center or in the pages of the newspapers that told his story. It was in the lives he touched, in the children he inspired, and in the changes he brought about. He had proven that, with courage and determination, it was possible to transform pain and injustice into something beautiful and lasting. And at that moment, surrounded by the young people he so strongly believed in, James felt he had finally found his true purpose. If you enjoyed the incredible story of James and Noah, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and want to support our channel to continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next emotional chronicle.